Hi everyone, it is my absolute delight to introduce Stefan Burns to you. Many of you have requested this, so here is the big day when we actually get to connect on the internet. So welcome Stefan, a joy to be with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for this as well. We have a lot of overlap, and you watch my videos, I watch your videos, so our ascendants are opposite each other.
Absolutely, yes. So this was destined to happen at some point. Stefan is a very unique individual with a very unique voice on the internet, on YouTube. He has a background in magnetics and seismology, but he is also a very gifted geophysicist and astrologer. So he often introduces himself as your space weatherman, and that fascinates me because in fairly recent past, we've only talked about weather, but broadly correlating with Pluto moving into Aquarius, and Pluto intensifies any sign it's moving through, and Aquarius is ruled by Uranus, the sky god. We now have started to talk about space weather. And I think Stefan has the most authoritative voice in that area of space weather. So he puts out almost a video a day. He has a rapidly growing YouTube channel, just packed full of information and data. So obviously I put his website below this so you can follow his work, and he's much loved by his audience. So really looking forward to getting into this conversation, Stefan. So I'd like to start with some data you were sharing just in the last day or so about the correlation between solar activity and seismic activity.
Okay.
So if you want to kind of take it from there, because I found that slightly surprising, because the sort of the inverse of what one might think, perhaps.
Yeah, we know there's something because if you look at these long-term data sets with like sunspot numbers and other measures of solar activity, and then you also look at earthquakes, we see this correlation between them. But it's almost like an anti-correlation, actually. As sunspot numbers go up, we see that earthquake activity goes down. And then as sunspot numbers start to decrease, or in general solar activity decreases, then we see earthquake activity then starts to like rise up. I crunched the data just for 2025, and that anti-correlation has been really strong for 2025. It really goes to show you how after solar activity peaks and the Earth has been loaded with this energy, that's when we seem to see the Earth then respond by releasing some of that energy outwards afterwards. There's like a few different ways of understanding it. It's probably multifactorial, almost certainly it is. But like the simple understanding is that the sun is loading energy into the global electric circuit. And then once that loading phase is over and solar activity starts to diminish, the Earth responds and finally pushes it out with like a large magnitude earthquake. And then there's another explanation that could be a little bit more plasma based and invoke the plasma cosmology that we're starting to come into a better perspective and understanding of. Because people often see like right before, during, or after an earthquake, like balls of light or like just beams of light all of a sudden radiate out of the earth. Some of them have been caught on camera. So there's this idea that there's so much electrical energy in the earth itself that's actually able to create highly ionized matter, which is plasma, the fourth state of matter, which then, because it's highly vibrational, it shoots up from highly dense matter, which has a lot of gravity, and it wants to escape gravity effectively. So a lot more electromagnetic, which is a force that's 10 to 36 zeros stronger than the force of gravity. And so it just shoots up to like the ionosphere and out to space. But we see that with earthquakes sometimes. We see these plasma emissions. And after solar activity, typically the solar wind plasma will kind of become like less dense. And so perhaps it's like a vacuum type mechanism where all of a sudden now that you have this like osmosis almost, right? So there's this kind of other understanding of how this may work. But regardless, we see that the sun and the earth have this energetic exchange across a whole bunch of things, but one of them is earthquakes. Of course, we know it gives us our climate and Earth's temperature, and it affects weather and all these things. But for some reason, a lot of people are like in denial of this. So it seems very obvious to me. But the earthquake one is really fascinating.
Well, and what's so interesting is Stefan and I were supposed to be having this conversation yesterday.
Yeah.
And about 15 minutes before we got online, Stefan kind of messaged me and said, "Can't do it. Just been a magnitude 6 earthquake, right where I live. Got to go and do live stream." So it was interesting. That was downgraded, I think, to a 5.2 a little bit later. But because we've had such a flurry recently in the last couple of days of M-class flares, are you therefore anticipating that could lead, as that drop off occurs, into maybe some bigger seismic activity in the next couple of weeks or so? I mean, if you
Yeah.
look at the astrology is really powerful for the second
Yeah.
half.
Yeah, it's intense astrology. That's another piece of the puzzle that I'm glad I incorporated because it's made my space weather forecasting better. Like I really just got into this because um, I wanted, effectively, the last job I had, I realized I had a limitation in just my understanding of like physics and then also geophysics. And like you learn certain things like, okay, you learn how to do the data acquisition. Let's say you're out in the field and you're collecting seismic data or magnetic field data with a magnetometer. And you learn just how to do the processing steps with a program like Surfer or like ArcGIS or whatever, any of these different programs available. But then like you get the final data product and you start to like, okay, how do I actually interpret this? What am I seeing? I realized I had a limit there. So I wanted to do like my own sabbatical and I didn't really want to be limited by a master's, like a proper university program going beyond a bachelor's because I feel like I could probably self-direct my education a little bit better. So I took a sabbatical and just basically quit my job. And the way that I learned best is to teach others. So I started to make video products on what I was learning. This really started with the Schumann resonances, but it went into also space weather and earthquakes more and more. And then it went to astrology. And so I just look at these generalized principles that exist across all of them. And I'm glad I incorporated astrology into it because it's made me more accurate with my space weather forecasting. Because I'm like, oh, it looks like we have a whole bunch of conjunctions or different aspects that are all lining up at the same time. We probably are just going to have an intensification of what we're also seeing with the space weather. Um, and that's proven true. So yeah, I could share this chart really quick with daily sunspots and total energy from earthquakes. Here we have daily sunspots versus daily total earthquake energy measuring gigawatt hours. And this is for 2025. And this goes from the 1st actually to April 12th. I guess this graphic here, or to the 13th, sorry, April 13th. So this is just, it says the 12th there, it's actually 13th. But you see in orange are daily total earthquake energy. This is all the earthquakes, magnitude 4.5 and greater, summarized every single day. And so we have different scales. We have the Richter scale and like the moment magnitude scale. That's the one that's typically used now. So it's a 4.5 or a 5 or a 6 or a 7, whatever. That's associated with a certain amount of energy. And it scales such that a magnitude 5 earthquake is quite a bit weaker than a magnitude 6, which is quite a bit weaker than a 7 because it goes up 32 times in energy every magnitude up that you go. And so it's a log scale on the right y-axis in gigawatt hours. But you see our rhythm and solar activity in blue there. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but we see these rhythms in sunspots. And sunspots release a very high vibrational wavelength of light, X-ray light. So just like the X-ray you get at a doctor's office. And we see that when all of a sudden sunspot numbers start to go down or are near a minimum, that's when we see these really big increases in the total energy released from these earthquakes globally. And because of how it scales, one high magnitude earthquake will be by far the dominant release of energy for that day. So like on the right side of the screen, you see this global seismic burst where we had a whole bunch of earthquakes for about 2 weeks, perfectly lined up with this drop in sunspots. And that dropped so much because we had this really big feature on the sun called a coronal hole, which has special energetic dynamics with the solar wind and with the earth.
Was that the Myanmar 7.7?
That is, yeah, boom. And
Right
then
about the solar eclipse. time.
And the solar eclipse too. That's why I'm glad I studied the astrology because I'm like, that's also at the same time. Like, and you can look at the science of lunar phases and how that affects tides, ocean tides, earth tides. It also seems to enhance geomagnetic activity, depending on whether it's new moon or full moon. It seems to be greatest at the full moon and the greatest reduction with the new moon. But yeah, it's just like this data for 2025 is so clear showing that connection, and whether it's like the simple explanation of just the sun loads the earth with energy and then once it kind of pulls back, the earth then has the capability of releasing it, or whether you understand this from a plasma perspective, or even you can understand this from a cosmic perspective because we have these cosmic rays that are coming in, and these are highly charged particles traveling near the speed of light that have incredibly high energies. And when you have a lot of solar activity, it strengthens the heliosphere overall and causes more of those to reroute around the solar system in general. But when you get that to decrease, that's when these cosmic rays come in. And you have the most cosmic rays during solar minimum, and you have the least amount during solar maximum. But there's also these shorter term secular variations. And so these create these ionized paths, and it's speculated that these ionized paths that they created can host these electric currents, which can cause a fault to finally rupture and boom, you get an earthquake. So there's like a whole bunch of different ways of understanding this. It's probably all of them at the same time, in my opinion. But just this graphic here for just 2025 thus far really shows it nicely. And there's other data for longer time frames that also shows earthquakes clustering around the descending phase and the minimum phase of solar cycles. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting anti-correlation and this cause and effect. And some people say it's just a correlation, but it's hard to be a little bit more causative than the sun unless you start talking about like quantum physics and like the quantum reality matrix or something. Like, what is causing this to manifest? That's probably what is the underlying agent of it all. And astrology also then will reflect some of these quantum changes that we're going through. But again, you can't really get more causative than the sun because you turn the sun off, all of a sudden the earth is a cold, lifeless place.
Absolutely.
Simple
Yeah, we'll
equation.
get this morning. So there's a very active sunspot at the moment, isn't there, Stefan, the 4055?
Yeah, it just rotated off.
So, Stefan, what are the correlations, if any? I mean, you've quoted the work of J.H. Nelson in some of your videos, and it'd be good to share that with my audience as well, his research about what correlations you are seeing of particular astrological aspects or combinations that seem to correlate with seismic activity, heightened seismic activity.
Yeah, that's I think probably the hardest to paint a picture because astrology is so dynamic, or even just we could just say astronomy and planetary geometry is just so dynamic. It's hard to pin it on any one thing. And there's quite a lot of people that are looking at this. There's one guy on Twitter X, Richard Cortaro or Cortado, who, I mean, he's like posting multiple times every day, examining like moon, Saturn, Jupiter aspect, and he shows the magnetic anomaly, then the earthquake, and it's fairly convincing stuff. He's a physicist. He's fully in on the planetary geometry and earthquake aspect. J.H. Nelson was a shortwave, long wave radio engineer back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they had just started to utilize like sunspot numbers and those sort of measurements and tracking solar cycles to understand how that affected the ionosphere and therefore the sort of radio frequency communication, like ham radio, basically. Because that was a very important way of communication going from the United States to Europe. And they wanted to know, are we going to have the ability to communicate or not? And so he started noticing just these connections between planetary geometry from a heliocentric perspective and disturbances, both on the sun and also on the earth. And so the really interesting thing, he wrote a short book. It's like 80 pages called Cosmic Patterns. He laid out some examples of big geomagnetic disturbances and the heliocentric planetary geometry at the time. And so having the background already in astrology made it really easy to read that because I already had the basis of understanding of the angles and everything. And right around 1960, there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, so that geometry was active for a lot of his broadcasts. And that was also when we had a really strong solar cycle 19, which went from like 54 to 64. That's also when we had some of the most powerful earthquakes of the past 100 something years. Most of them were clustered right around the strongest solar cycle. So you start to see how this all works. He talked about Mercury being an activator and how its fastest orbital velocity, if it moves into a preset configuration with the inner planets and the outer planets, can seem to activate it. And in fact, we had that set up back from March 23rd to 25th or so when we had the Mercury and the Venus cazimi. And so I just finished reading the book and I plotted the heliocentric chart, and it was like this incredible geometry active because we had Uranus and Pluto in a trine, both of them sextile to Saturn and Neptune, which were effectively conjunct, close enough for the purpose of this, who were in opposition to all the inner planets except Mars. Jupiter square to the inner planets and Saturn and Neptune from the heliocentric model. And he was talking about how if there's like harmonic configurations like trines, that helps to like amplify the energy. So just going by what he wrote, it was like a perfect example. And then we had a G2 storm and then that global seismic burst that resulted. And so it's a really good example of how the planetary geometry seems to influence the solar activity and the geophysics, or they're all just, again, kind of representations of something bubbling up from a more quantum field, you could say. But we have another configuration like that coming up May 17th. So I'm looking at that date kind of closely.
Wow, that's super interesting. Yeah, and we've got one heck of a full moon coming up in Scorpio as well, early in the month.
Yeah, I haven't
Yeah,
looked at the chart for that, but that should be opposite Uranus, roughly, right?
correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty much spot on.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
then
so
also
that's going
square
to be
Mars. So,
yeah, and actually, I remember many many years ago, and this wasn't heliocentric. It was geocentric, but the presenter done a huge study, had a background in seismology, and he'd done a big study on astrological correlations to big earthquakes, 5 plus. And what he found was the most common signature was a hard aspect between Mars and Uranus, particularly when they were in fixed signs. So
mm,
hard aspect meaning conjunction square opposition, and fixed signs you could understand because with fixity there's nowhere for the energy to go. It builds and builds and builds and then blows because both Mars and Uranus want to drive forwards. And so that that felt right. And whenever I've looked at big earthquake activity myself in the past, if I do the astrocartography for that moment based on that location, I would guess, and I haven't done a statistical study, but I would guess 9 times out of 10, I either get Mars, Uranus, or Pluto angular, so they
mm.
have greater potency. And in particular, Uranus, because that's the planet of earthquakes, and in particular, on the IC, i.e., the land, the home base. So it's an eruption on the home base in that locality for that moment. And it just feels so right astrologically. I mean, obviously it's not great for the people on the ground, but I see that again and again, that angularity, particularly of Uranus, but also to some extent of Mars and Pluto. So and that's well worth tracking because I think there's a whole new modality that could emerge, and you would be the person to take it on, Stefan, of geophysics, astrology, and consciousness actually emerging. Um, and you would have the background to kind of merge those. And that would be a very interesting thing to look at if you look at the astrocartography at the moment of the earthquake.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of that. It starts to really, it's like a tree, then it really starts to get into the branches, and that all requires time. But there are some people which look at the astrocartography very closely for earthquakes. But that definitely is like the next level of detail, you could say. And I'm hesitating a little bit of, let's say, looking in advance to see where some of these um, moments could perhaps, you know, hit the earth. these earthquakes because of upcoming transits in astrocartography. But that definitely seems to be the next step. I mean, the last big earthquake we had, other than Myanmar and Burma, was the 7.8 in Turkey.
Yeah,
That was actually 7.8, 7.5. And Uranus was square to the moon and the sun on that.
yeah,
And then back with the last time we had that Uranus square to the moon and sun, um, this was in just like February. We had this weird seismic swarm in Greece. And I put out a video, like just warning, hey, we could have a big earthquake because there were so many parallels. We did not have a big earthquake from that, thankfully, but we did have that very anomalous seismic swarm in Greece, and then also a seismic burst in Campi Flegrei just a few days afterwards. So it just expressed itself that way. But Uranus definitely seems to resonate with the Earth in an interesting way, and astronomically, it's tilted on its side, and its magnetic field is either pointing towards or effectively pointing away from the ecliptic plane and the sun, like whether it's in or out, because it has such a slow rotation and everything. And so that dynamic's very interesting. The outer gas giants and also Earth, they are these particle accelerators, and Jupiter really broadcasts a lot of relativistic particles out throughout the solar system, but I imagine Neptune and Uranus and Saturn do as well. The Jovian flux, as it's known, is the most well measured, but there's perhaps ways for the outer gas giants to influence the other planets through that sort of particle flux, because we're seeing that cosmic rays, which is particle flux, has influences on our cloud cover and on our weather and on our geophysics on the planet. So yeah, it's a huge open field that I'm really excited to see more people step into as we move deeper into like Pluto and Aquarius and Age of Aquarius coming up, because it's that blend of like science and spirit. And
maybe one of the reasons it's hard to predict as well, predict specific locations, is because if you're looking at the astrocartography, obviously the whole chart for any area is changing degree by degree, roughly every 4 minutes. It varies slightly by season, but it's a rapidly moving rotation through the 24 hours. So that makes it very hard to predict, in any one moment, if an earthquake was going to happen, when the planets are going to become angular, because there are just so many variables to that across the globe. But is there any correlation, Stefan? I'm thinking of solar cycles being around about 12 years long. Yes,
Mhm.
but that's also the orbit of Jupiter.
Yeah.
Is there any correlation between the Jupiter cycle? There must be, and solar max cycles. There must be, because they're both the same length.
Yeah, there has been like some research done looking at the orbital revolution of Jupiter and solar cycles, and I think that's really compelling. I think there's probably something to that. I don't think it's just chance that we have that. And then actually, if you zoom out a little bit further, we have what are known as Gleisberg cycles, which are about 88-year-long variations in solar activity, where you have a longer period of heightened and then decrease. And there's even lower frequency ones that are like hundreds of years long. Um, but 88 years is pretty close to 84, which is Uranus. So there seems to be, and then archetypally, Uranus being the grandfather of Jupiter or Zeus, right? So there's this, there's a lot of ways to kind of understand this, and we don't have any like super hard data on it, but at the minimum, it makes you think. I think it's worth keeping your mind open to it and exploring it more. One of my subscribers, he commented that solar max seems to align when, from the sun's perspective, you have Jupiter and the galactic center aligned, which I guess is active right now. Something,
Yeah, it
or
must be, because it's getting late into Gemini, isn't it? So it'll be, yeah.
yeah, precisely. So that seems interesting too, because that's going to be the source of your highest energy cosmic rays,
Yeah.
which, and also if we do incorporate more of an electric universe understanding of cosmology and let's say these massive electric currents superconducting flowing through not only the universe but galaxies and interstellar space arriving to our sun, well, the center of our galaxy is going to be one of the main hubs of these Birkeland currents, as they're known, these plasma currents. And so they'd be coming off of that galactic center to the sun. And then Jupiter being this huge gravitational influence and also a plasma influence because it's producing all these ions and radio emissions and more. I could see that being a modulating influence. So,
And you've talked a lot as well, Stefan, about your concern about the increasing electrification of the Earth. Do you want to talk about that? Because that's something that bothers me quite a lot too, because this is unprecedented, isn't it? We've never had the number of satellites that we've got orbiting the Earth right now.
yeah, there's a few aspects. Earth electrification is just what I'm calling it, but I mean, there's authors who've wrote about this going back decades. So there's hard data basically showing that like thunderstorm frequency increased like quite dramatically, going from the beginning of the 1900s to up to like 1930, 1940, and then more data even beyond that. A lot of this stuff just needs new people just to crunch the numbers. We have the numbers, but just no one's crunched them because a lot of people just immediately discount some of these things. But there's already this influence of our electrical activity here on Earth, it seems, upon not only our climate, but upon our weather. Because we know that we have like greenhouse gas emissions and that matters. So like there's an effect from that. But there's these other things too that also have an effect. So just the amount of low frequency energy that is being pumped out from power grids was one aspect of Earth electrification. You literally can't go anywhere on the planet in like a normal zone and not pick up either 50 hertz or 60 hertz energy. So if you're doing a magnetic field survey, you always have to filter that out. It just shows up everywhere. And then just recently you add on all the cellular networks and 4G and really 5G, and 5G is absorbed into water like crazy. And so now you're altering to a much greater degree than even just 5 years ago, the energetics of water, which you're a huge researcher into because, you've had Veda Austin on the channel and, now we're starting to talk about consciousness. And so, it goes into all these things.
And she's done some crystallography on 5G, and it's just like the water has had a shock.
Oh,
It's
really?
just,
Okay.
had an electric shock. But the good news she found in her crystallography was if she allowed the water to rest for a period of time and then exposed it again to 5G, it had normalized to some extent. It's almost like nature had run ahead and been able to adapt the water's reaction to 5G, which gives us some hope, actually, that, I always feel optimistic that nature runs ahead of the problem. But still, this increased electrification is coming so thick and fast, isn't it? Because of the satellite activity as well.
And
It's the speed at which it's happening.
yeah, and that's like the newest layer that's added on because we've already had satellites, but now with Starlink and soon other mega constellations coming online, the number is going up exponentially. And they're made of these metallic ions, and we're putting mass where there typically isn't mass in the Earth system. And this is going to degrade the ozone layer because these aluminum particles will react with ozone and form aluminum oxide. They just found out that the bees in North America had like aluminum poisoning. So a lot of people are like, is that connected to it? But you're also just going to make the Earth more conductive in these upper parts of the atmosphere called the ionosphere, and even a little bit lower down and further up. And that's going to probably create a positive feedback loop because the satellites are more likely to experience anomalous charging and malfunctions when there's stronger geomagnetic storms like we're in right now. We're having one hit us at this moment in time as we're recording. And then you add in everything else. And also Starlink, like these satellites are beaming 5G down to the surface. They have a very wide swath. And so then you also create these magnetic ducts through the ionosphere, which allows more solar particles to come in. And so my thing is like, I don't think we should be playing with the Earth so much, you could say, in this manner. But it is happening, and I guess at the end of the day, my philosophy is that this is some necessary catalyst for like a wave of increased consciousness for the planet itself. Because the more electrical activity there is, I would stipulate that the more consciousness there is. And so I think we're agents of this increased consciousness for the planet and therefore all life. And so it's good news to hear about this 5G, that there's some level of ability to adapt to it because we definitely need that. It's very powerful energy. It's very potent. It gives us, it's very biologically active. People think it's not biologically active. It's very biologically active. It has a ton of non-thermal effects. So
Right.
it's very important to be aware of.
So can you share with people, Stefan, because I know you've looked into this, how all of that affects our consciousness, the research you've done about that?
I just have this personal belief that we're all effectively the cells of the earth. And and so our choices influence the larger aggregate. And if Earth is becoming more conscious and we're nested within that, I think that's just going to drive overall an increase in the heightening of consciousness. There's also, I mean, for example, general resonance theory, which I really resonate with, which is just an idea of understanding consciousness through resonance and how the more these vibrations you have stacked upon one another, the more conscious something is. Because you can take a pebble and if you look at like the atomic structure, you'll still see it like vibrating. But the pebble doesn't really have any like electric currents running through it other than the naturally occurring ones. Whereas the human body, we have our own bioelectric currents and we're this very complex system of resonances and vibrations and everything. And it seems that we're a bit more conscious than the pebble, though the pebble, I think, has some level of consciousness too. This also goes off of the work of like Itzhak Bentov, who I think was really a pioneer into the study and field of consciousness and the spiral of consciousness. But if there's just in general more electrical activity in our on our planet, stronger telluric currents in the ground surface, stronger and more volatile weather patterns. Thunderstorms are basically one massive ball of energy moving through, just causing radio emissions out like crazy. That overlaps with all of our different bioelectric body resonances. I would think that there's going to just be a tide of increased consciousness around the planet. And some of that may manifest itself as people get used to that, just like maybe a lot of volatility and agitation. For others, if they've done some work and they know how to work with that, it can be like more states of bliss and calm and peace and understanding. Just hanging out with my friend and his brain runs really fast. He's like, dude, I don't like to think. Like, I don't want to think. And so there's that aspect. Like, it could turn people's brains on very, very strongly with Uranus moving into Gemini soon. I think we're going to see that really activate. So another reason why I'm like the astrology has something to it because it all just really resonates and lines up. But I think we'll get used to this. Not everyone's going to make it. Just because there's always people hopping off to a different star system or whatever, right? Not everyone stays here on Earth forever. But I think fundamentally we'll get used to this and we're just going to become more electrical beings and less material based and more plasma based, you could say. There's
Yeah,
what's the
I'd
scientific
really agree
evidence
with
for
that.
this, but I think that's where we're going. It's going to get proven with time.
Yeah, I really agree with that. So, how does the increased electrification out there, because everything's connected, affect the core of the Earth as well, Stefan? Do you have any information on that? I mean, does that actually, if it's increasing the volatility of the weather, is it also potentially leading to higher seismic activity? So activating the core of the Earth as well. I don't. You have any data on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The problem with, well, it's not a problem with Earth. It's kind of our limitation is that we know very little about what's happening in the center of our planet. Effectively, we really only have like three types of measurements. We have magnetic field measurements, and we know that there's something generating a magnetic field under the surface. And then we have seismic measurements, And so we see how sound waves travel through the earth, and we get those from really big earthquakes, which are strong enough to get picked up all across the world. And we look at the data and we have some understanding that there's like a liquid core, an outer core, and then there's a solid inner core and the properties of the mantle existing above that. And then we also have helium measurements. And we know that there's helium that's coming out of the earth. And the mainstream belief is that the helium is from a deep helium reservoir created from the accretion of the planet. But what makes a lot more sense to me is that helium is being produced through a georeactor. So basically nuclear fission within the center of the earth. And when you have uranium and these fissile products being created, some of those are helium fundamentally. And helium being such a light element that also doesn't react to things because it's a noble gas is going to want to move out of very high density to very low density, just like a balloon floats up in the atmosphere. Well, it's going to float up a lot faster in solid rock because it's even more dense. So I think that is a much better explanation for why we have so much helium coming out of the center of the planet. And if you have this slurry of light elements and charge carriers created from a geofission reaction, then you could also create a magnetic field from that. And perhaps a secondary effect is that all that energy also creates this liquid outer core, which we see with the seismic measurements and verified also with the magnetic field measurements. So those are the three main things that we know about the core. As it relates to our Earth electrification and how then it works down reciprocally, that's a good question. I don't know. I definitely think there's some connection, some flow of energy, because I don't think you can have one and not the other, like as within, so without, that kind of belief, as below, so above. So I think it's just going to, it may be an effect that's geologic in scale. I think sometimes as humans, we look at everything from a very human perspective and we want to understand things like, okay, wow, it's a lot of energy that, let's say, hit this thing in one day. But I think the effect of this Earth electrification and just this, it might be a very slight increase in energy flux moving along these field lines that eventually get to the core because that's where they're produced. I think that might manifest over a geologic scale, hundreds of years, thousands of years, which is then over time significant enough to produce, let's say, recognizable changes. But then sorting out that signal from the noise is a whole different equation. But just having some basic understanding of like physics allows you to know that there's going to be some connection no matter what, because magnetic fields travel out to infinity. And so it may be very, very small, but with like some of the quantum physicists, you know, what they kind of wrote down and what they believe is that it's not the amplitude of the quantum field that matters, it's just the information within it that matters. So it doesn't matter if it's incredibly small or insignificant in its amplitude, it's just the fact that the information is there. And so we are working with all this, of course, not just in the material realm, but also in the plasma and in the quantum realm. And so I don't know what the changes are going to be for the core. It's a very big question mark, but I think fundamentally we are starting to interact with the Earth geophysically in ways that are still very much beyond our comprehension, and we'll find out way later down the road, if we're still here, what they were.
Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. And you've referred a few times recently, Stefan, to the Carrington event, which happened in September 1859. For those people who don't know, there was a huge coronal mass ejection, which essentially fried the first attempt at the internet. It was the kind of Victorian telegram system. And does the electrification of the Earth add to that possibility, Stefan? Or is it totally down to the CME? Because it's a long time since 1859. I'm
Yeah.
surprised there hasn't been anything like that since 1859.
Yeah, so the Carrington event has a little bit of the fact that it's become a bit of like a legend now has increased the story and just exaggerated it a little bit, but certainly if we had something equivalent hit us now, it'd be like, holy cow, this is wild, right? We don't know what would happen in terms of like our power grids. We would almost certainly have power grid failures in some parts around the world, more likely the high latitude regions like Canada or Northern Europe and maybe even like Australia, South New Zealand, possibly. But the effects of that are still very much an unknown. But effectively, what happens is you get these really powerful geomagnetically induced currents. And the Carrington event is special because it's a very powerful wave of plasma that was sent our way. And it had a very fast transit time because the solar wind was, in general, fairly low density. And so it was able to propagate through very quickly. We've had other solar storms very similar. One was in 1872, another in 1921, 1972, and then 2012 missed us. We also just had a huge one launch on March 28th to Jupiter that was closer to the Carrington event than not to it, if that makes any sense. And so that we know the sun launches these things. How it affects us now is basically it just generates these really powerful currents in the ionosphere, which is part plasma, and then those induce currents down in the ground surface. But how this affects us now is that because of Earth electrification, we have in general just more energy and charge on the Earth overall than back then. And so the potential for stronger ionosphere currents exist and therefore stronger geomagnetically induced currents. And we have a lot more like transmission lines and things of this nature. And the longer a conductor, then the stronger the geomagnetically induced current can be because they like to flow along high conductivity objects, you could say. And if you have an unbroken conductor, it's going to host these really big charge differentials, like 500, 1,000 volts, which could then blow out a transformer and cause a power grid failure. So I think, and then we had these like magnetic ducts that we're creating because of 5G, and we had the satellite issue, which is making, I think, geomagnetic storms stronger. You have all these things kind of just Earth electrification in general is going to make the Earth more volatile to any sort of external influence from a solar storm like a Carrington event, or you go one order of magnitude greater and get a super flare. And that's a big question. That's like 774 AD with like they're known as Miyake events. Like then we really don't know, but we know the sun's possible. It's capable of doing that. But that's definitely something to be aware of. And as we've grown so technologically dependent, that's going to become a bigger and bigger risk. Whereas back then, they had some telegraph wires get burned down. And one of the reports is that they actually turned off their batteries and they were still able to do their transmissions because the lines were already alive with that geomagnetically induced current. And so they were
Wow.
communicating without batteries. Um, Tesla would have loved it. He would have
Yeah,
loved it.
yeah.
If he had his equipment set up at that time and he happened to be right on it, he would have been like, this is incredible. So it just goes to show you the incredible energy that the sun has and how it can influence us across long time spans, but then also very short human time spans. Um, but that's something that we should just be very mindful of. And yeah, you start to get that bigger picture once you talk about and understand to some degree Earth electrification and then space weather. And then you look at the astrology with this historic Saturn-Neptune conjunction that is about to basically within less than a year now go exact, the beginning of the zodiac. And it's in fire and we have fire, fire, fire. We're gonna have Jupiter and Leo soon, and it's like, okay, we got a lot of fire energy in the sky. Pluto's in Aquarius and nice configurations to them, and
Not
yeah,
much Earth.
yeah,
Once
not
Uranus moves
anymore.
into Gemini, we're pretty short on Earth.
Yeah,
It's a
it's
stabilizing
only
factor.
the only Earth left basically is those who were born in '93 that have that Uranus Neptune conjunction natally. They're going to carry
Yeah,
that forward for like the next
yeah, yeah.
100 something years, but. Um, Yeah, so I think that's a big, big factor in what's happening with Earth energetically, but then also with what you're very much interested in, same with your audience, hello everyone, is the evolution of consciousness on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah, big time. Because I think we have some beautiful configurations starting to come in now that'll be more exact in 2026 and starting to fade out a little bit in 2027. But I think they are so promising versus a lot of the challenging astrology we've had over recent years, recent couple of decades. And so although 2025 I think is a very turbulent year astrologically because we've got all the outer planets changing signs and many other things. I actually, as we get into 2026, particularly kind of late spring onwards, I start to feel much more optimistic, and whether that will calm down seismic activity or whatever is another matter. But I actually think that there is huge potential for, I think we're in it. I think we are absolutely in the chrysalis, and this jump of consciousness that I know many people felt as we went through that last part of March. And I certainly had quite a lot of drama around that time.
Mm.
That was a real jump, and many other people did too. And I think that was just the first of many to come. And so I actually feel very optimistic and excited that even though we might have some very challenging you know, geocosmic activity and magnetics more than we ever have done, that it is actually going to lead us to a better place. And it's a little bit like what happened in 2020 seemed to be not so great, but actually acted as a catalyst for many people to change habits and behaviors and connections, etc. And I think that the electrification of the earth and all that's happening could be another one of those. It turns out to be not so, initially not so good, and then actually one of the best things that ever happened to us in terms of our consciousness. That's where I'm at, because the astrology looks so positive going into 2026. How do you feel, Stefan?
Yeah, I resonate with that because I would rather see the world from a more benefic perspective than just, okay, everything's awful. So, as long as people are aware of the real health effects of this, and in general, as we enter into more and more air energy, because we have the last, for example, Pluto, Neptune in Gemini, Uranus moving in Gemini, Jupiter was just in Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius. People just being aware of the fact that I think weather on the planets is going to be a little bit more agitated, powerful, and volatile. Just being aware of that is good. But yeah, I think fundamentally it's going to be a catalyst for some really good changes, and but it's going to take time to play out. I'd rather just look at it optimistically than not. At the end of the day, it is what it is. If you manage your health and your wellness and you have that foundation set, then all this extra energy in the environment created through anthropogenic activity, but also from increased solar activity and perhaps even cosmic forces, like, for example, the gamma ray burst we had in 2022, October 9th, the most powerful that we've ever received, what they believe to be a 1 in 10,000 year event. I think that is grossly underlooked by astrologers because that's a huge, huge burst of high frequency energy from like 2.5 billion light years away. And I think we're still working with that energy. I think it was
We're
early
still here,
degrees.
and we're still here.
Yeah, yeah. So that there's a whole bunch of these things, but um, overall, I'm optimistic. So long as like you're doing you're taking upon the responsibility needed to be healthy. Otherwise, I do think these things can manifest negatively, and a lot of people certainly are feeling these energies very strongly, to put it one way. And so it's a force for greater accountability and self-responsibility.
Yeah,
Um,
is there anything, because I know you've talked a lot in your videos, Stefan, about the effect of all of this electrification on the biology. I asked you earlier about the consciousness, but coming back to our biology, you've got some great advice. Would you like to share that about how it affects your biology and what you can do to boost your immune system, etc., and your health? Because I think that's going to be crucial going forwards for all kinds of reasons.
yeah, I mean, it gets really complex if you get into the weeds and the details, which is one of the failings, in my opinion, of modern science, is that we dissect things too much and then we differentiate them and we lose sight of those generalized principles, as Buckminster Fuller calls them, that lie and exist across all the domains, which is why I look into all these different things and see the connections with them. But I think it's really, if you just go back and understand how we used to live and see the things that naturally happen, you get a really good understanding of this. So the first big one, if you don't have air, you're dead in like not even 3 minutes, unless you're a free diver. So what's your air quality? Are you breathing good air? Um, Make sure you have that down. Okay, next is water. You're dead in, let's say, like 3 days without water. So are you drinking good water? Tap water is not good for you. Read the research on how that calcifies the pineal gland. It's like good, just solid research out there about calcification is not a good thing in your body. You don't want calcification. Um, Next is food, right? Eat like organic. You get those foundations, you're pretty much good to go with the big three. The last one is, are you connecting to the earth? Are you decharging the body? Are you replenishing your extracellular matrix with charge? To go into some of the detail, your bone has a whole bunch of copper ions embedded within it. And actually, copper is very rarely used with modern agriculture as a sort of fertilizer. And so most fields are extremely deficient in copper. And I just found out I was copper deficient. And one way to tell is if you get like random spasms, like muscle spasms, it's effectively you get some errant neural spikes in your brain that are causing just random muscle twitches and spasms. That's a copper deficiency. And a lot of people load up on zinc, but they don't load up on copper, and zinc outcompetes copper. But your bone is loaded with these copper ions, which have a bunch of free electrons to them. And your fascia also has all these sort of free electrons embedded within them because they're semiconductor in nature, and so they can host or not host electric charge. And so one way to replenish that is to connect to the earth because you have all these lightning strikes happening all the time. Geologic minerals will have these free electrons, and our hands, our feet are superconductive. And so you can connect to it and actually get this. It's called grounding or earthing. Much of your audience is probably already doing this, which is great. But
Talk
I
about
think,
it a lot. Yeah.
yeah, I know you discussed it as well. That is definitely another piece of that equation for air, water, food, and then grounding, earthing. And, back during the Neolithic period, the air was basically clean unless there was a forest fire or a dust storm. There a lot of the waterways are probably like Iceland, where you can just drink straight from them because they're effectively not polluted. And then all the food was effectively organic and biodynamic, just naturally. So, and then they were always earthy and grounding because they didn't have rubber-soled shoes, and they had mud huts with the floor is right there with the mud. So they were doing it all naturally back then, and I think that's the easiest way to look at how you can get your foundation set and ready to handle these increased energies on the planet, this consciousness evolution pulse that we're receiving, and to work with that in a very positive way.
And you can put your water in copper bottles. That's one good thing to do. And the soil is now very depleted in selenium. You can have Brazil nuts to sort that out. Very depleted in iodine. You can take, particularly nascent iodine is a very good thing to take because it's much more bioavailable. So there are various things you can do, knowing that our soil is extremely deficient because of poor agricultural practices in recent times. So, but Stefan, I really have great optimism around that because I just have a sense that these things are going to be turned around much more quickly than we imagine. I mean, recently they discovered a fungus that naturally thrives on plastics.
Mm.
They're just, it's like a gourmet meal to eat plastic. So, I think we're going to, because nature is so intelligent, I think there are going to be ways that we can turn things around faster than the A, then the B, then the C in a very linear way, because we're moving out of linearity.
Hmm.
We're moving into multidimensionality, as we know. So I think these times are going to find solutions in bigger ways than we can currently articulate, really.
I hope so.
So, yeah, ever the born optimist. This has been a wonderful conversation, Stefan. Is there anything else you'd like to share or add at this point? I know you sell certain products as well to help people with their health. You've got grounding shoes. You've got a specific tea as well that you have, a herb tea. So, and all to benefit people's health.
Yeah, I would love to send you some of the spirituality. I haven't done a shipment to the UK yet, so you give you my first trial with that, but we'll figure that out a little bit offline. And yeah, there's earthing shoes and boots available on the website wildfreeorganic.com. Those ship international. They allow you to stay grounded more often in your day to day. I worked with a group out of Turkey. This is like the normal summer shoe that they make and wear in Turkey when it's very hot. And they approached me because I was making videos on earthing and grounding, and then I already had design ideas to make them better. So we've been now collaborating to improve the design to make basically the ultimate earthing shoe. There is one other thing I wanted to show you as it relates to the Venus cycle,
Okay.
because we had the Venus Cazimi on March 22nd, and then we had that global seismic burst and that coronal hole and the G2 storm and all that shortly after. And we had that
That's
really
really
incredible heliocentric planetary geometry. So I want to show you how the Venus Cazimi leads to another incredibly significant planetary geometry on January 6th, which is very reminiscent of the planetary geometry that we had in 1859 with the Carrington event.
January 6th, 2026.
Yeah. So you'll see this. Let me screen share. So we're looking at an application called Solar System Scope.
Yeah.
And I actually have this set back to 1964. I've seen the planetary geometry during the Alaska earthquake, which was a 9.2. And there wasn't anything super significant with planetary geometry for that earthquake, just from my quick analysis, but there's more to do. But if we let's go to what's happening right now, 2025, and we're actually pretty close to that Cazimi. But here's that Venus Cazimi right there.
Yeah.
And so we see Neptune and Saturn in that opposition. We see Jupiter in the square to them. We see Uranus and Pluto in the trine to inner planets. But really, most importantly, Venus is in this inferior conjunction with the Sun. Now, if we zoom forward to the next Venus Cazimi, all the way to January 6th,
Yeah.
which is going to be right here.
Right.
Now we see this really incredible alignment. Jupiter, Earth, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, all in a perfect line, and Pluto not too far off from that either. But that is the next Venus Cazimi, so the next star point. And this geometry itself actually gets a little bit more precise on the 10th of January. But there's a bit of a window with these things. So anywhere from like basically the beginning of January through the middle of January is when this geometry is active. But you don't see this every day. I looked through the record quite a bit. It's very rare to see a geometry like this with this line. All the inner planets and even Jupiter, our biggest heavyweight, there in this alignment with the sun.
Wow.
Um,
And you think of Venus as a benefic.
yeah.
So it's so interesting. It appears in this correlation to be really powerful.
Yeah, there's a lot more here to explore because it is perfect with this Venus cycle, right? I mean, maybe there's some Jupiter cycle with this too or whatever, but it's really a perfect connection with the Venus cycle because we go from the last one, what would it be like right about here, that Venus Cazimi, all the
Yep.
way straight to the next one. And it's a perfect. And then on February 20th, we have these two
Saturn,
going
Neptune.
exact, Neptune and Saturn. And
Yeah.
so this is just, I'm looking at this from like an energy congregation perspective.
Yep.
And if we had this big global seismic burst, as we saw in the data at the beginning of the video, and also the geomagnetic disturbances and the largest coronal hole that we've seen in like a decade or more, like anomalously large during the last Venus Cazimi when we had this incredible planetary geometry across the entire solar system. Only Mars was loosely participating. Everything else was locked into a configuration, which Mercury then activated. Then with the next one, we see an equally potent planetary geometry with this line, which is an almost identical setup that we had with the Carrington event in 1859. It was a very similar alignment like this. So I don't know what
Well,
to think of it. I'm just looking at this like there's going to be something that happens. I don't know how it's going to express itself, but I just feel like there's going to be something that happens around this time frame.
wow.
Um,
And
so
just before the Saturn-Neptune conjunction becomes exact at 0 of Aries,
yeah,
046. Wow, well, that certainly would be a new beginning, wouldn't it? Whatever manifests.
yeah.
Wow. Was Ceres in a square to that lineup?
pretty close to a square.
So that's
Yeah,
interesting in itself, isn't it?
she's well, if we had to draw a square, Saturn and Neptune in series would basically make like the whisker, the TV antenna whiskers of the
Yep.
square in the middle.
Yep.
So interesting. I also think series is really important and should be taken a
Yeah,
lot
me
more
too.
seriously and looked at a lot more closely as it relates to astrology. But that's a different
And to the
conversation.
earth and to harvest and food production and all that kind of thing. I
Yeah.
think it's a really big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. She worked very closely with the Saturn, Pluto, Mercury, Sun,
She was in
uh,
that big conjunction, wasn't she?
and
12th of
yeah, and the
Jan
series is
2020.
there.
She was right in the middle of that conjunction, which,
Yeah.
changed our world.
And then that she, with her retrograde, she went to basically exactly that degree, went back.
November.
So it was very clear that she was working with that one of the most powerful synodic cycles that we've had in a long time because it has such a congregation, the Sun, Mercury, Ceres, Pluto, and Saturn, which is phenomenal.
And wasn't she back there at 22 degrees of Capricorn last November?
She was there when Pluto shifted in too. Yeah, she was at the same point right when Pluto shifted in, activating the prior great conjunction, great mutation with Jupiter and Saturn. So it's like she's like this key kind of for a lot of these things, or at least a big participant in ways that maybe not everyone has noticed yet. So
Yeah, and related to the seasons because of what happened to Persephone, etc. It was very related to, summer, winter seasons, and yeah, and the underworld, and that's really very interesting indeed.
yeah.
Wow. Stefan, I've loved this conversation. It's been pretty out there at times, and we've covered, certainly for my viewers, some very different grounds. So I hope everybody has really enjoyed that. And Stefan is just a wealth of knowledge in a way that I think virtually nobody else is out there at the moment, certainly on YouTube. So I just want to thank you, Stefan, for your time and all of your energy and effort. And I do think you're creating new modalities or combinations of disciplines that are going to really help us go forwards as humanity. So I just really like to thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I have a lot of fun doing this. I feel very aligned on like my soul purpose, life mission path. Uh, but what I really hope to see more so is that this inspires a whole bunch of people to go in this direction as well. Because one person can't do it alone. I'm certainly not the only one that is doing this. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. There's many other people also exploring this, but it's certainly not mainstream. Um, but I think it's going to become a lot more mainstream and accepted and understood in the future as a result of conversations like this. So I'm very thankful for you hosting me, and we'll have you on my channel very soon. We'll talk astrology to everybody.
Beautiful, Stefan. Thanks so much for your time and sending much love to everybody out there who's been with us for the last hour or so. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thank you.